Hello, everyone, and welcome to this taped discussion between Professors Catia Antunes, Professor of History of Global Economic Networks in Leiden, with a focus on the early modern period, and Anne-Isabelle, who's a lecturer at Leiden University with research interest in European and world history from the late 19th century onwards. Cyrus and I have invited them not only because of their obvious expertise on global history, but also in their function as editors-in-chief of the wonderful journal Itinerario, Journal of Imperial and Global Interaction, published by Cambridge University Press. On the other hand, I'd like to present to you Cyrus Schayegh, who is Professor of International History and Politics at the Graduate Institute Geneva, who's focusing with his research on 20th century Middle East from a global history point of view. My name is Dries Lyna. I'm an assistant professor in Nijmegen, and my research mainly deals with social histories of colonial cities across early modern Dutch Asia. Cyrus and I are here presenting the Global Urban History Project, and perhaps just in a couple of sentences, a bit of background on that project. Guhp, as it is abbreviated, was founded in 2017, and it brings together scholars working on the crossroads of urban and global history. Its goal is to encourage the study of cities as creations and creators of large-scale or global historical phenomena, thereby minimizing the somewhat traditional Eurocentric and US-centric focus on urban history, while also connecting early modern historians, like some of us here, with other ones here, those of us working on more recent periods. In 2020, we started with a mentorship program where we connect emerging researchers with more established scholars in the field. And this year we've added so-called dream conversations to the roster, in which we discuss current and future topics that are relevant for global urban history. We have created 4 different tracks, and today's talk will feature within the second track, the track called Cities, Empires, and Discontents. One of the most fascinating and impactful developments in the fields of empire studies and colonialism in the past decade or so has been the rise of interest in inter and intra and trans-imperial and colonial histories. And that's sort of what this track is all about. In the next 40-45 minutes, we'll see where we get. We would like to sit together with Professors Antunes and Schayegh to reflect on the central question: what is the relationship between empires and global cities? And sort of to start off the conversation, I would like to ask Professor Catia Antunes, we sort of have a preparatory talk, of course, to reflect on the, and I'm just picking it up right now as we speak, to reflect on the thesis, are all global cities in the early modern period imperial, yes or no? Because you had some very strong ideas about that. I would love to hear more in that respect.
Well, thank you, Dries, for your very kind introduction, and thank you to Guhp to actually invite the Itinerario for this conversation. So yes, the clear answer from my side to your question for the early modern period, I believe that the largest urban settlements in the world between, say, 1500 and 1800 are imperial cities. And perhaps it's interesting or important to say, what do I think it's an imperial city? You have 2 types of imperial cities, if you want to: imperial cities that have been declared as such by a state, by an empire, and actually large cities that are large because they are the central stage for empire building. Which may be something slightly institutionally, but also in terms of law, slightly different. So if you look at the European landscape, then you would have very large cities like Amsterdam or Lisbon or Seville and Cadiz or London as large cities being connected to empire, while I believe that very few historians in Europe would think of them as imperial cities, because once we think about imperial cities, we think of cities, for instance, in Asia, in China, or in the Mughal Empire, Persian Empire, and whatnot. So I think it's important, this nuance in thinking of imperial cities. You can be an imperial city because the state has decided as such, has declared you as such, but you can also be actually an imperial city not being recognized as such. So my answer to you, between 1500 and 1800, I think the largest cities in the early modern landscape are actually imperial or directly connected to empire cities, heads of empire.
Thank you. The nuance that we would like to bring to the table then is the question, okay, if all, and let me say that I say it correctly now, if all global cities in the early modern period are imperial, not all cities in empires are global.
Yes.
That's an important nuance.
Yes, they may contribute to the global, usually through scales of exchanges, urban network exchanges, people, capital, ideas, products, but they are not hubs or gateways. If you want to use a more urban history jargon, they are not gateways either of empire or of globalization. So if you want to think more broadly about this, I think that one of the largest imperial cities is Beijing, but the largest global connector in China is actually Canton. So you see that an empire can have a very large that is important in terms of networking over thousands of kilometers of trade and people and mobility of people and ideas and whatnot, Beijing. But then when you look at the globality of it, I would say that Canton would be a far more global city than Beijing is, say, 1640 or 1700. The sizes of cities on the one hand, and also the direct relationship with the state that deploys empire determines quite a bit the role that these cities play, not only in the deployment of empire, but also what they can take or give the global world, so to speak. And if you reduce the global lenses, again, for Beijing, into the Sinocentric world, read here China, Korea, Japan, you see, of course, that the political core is Beijing still, because all the diplomatic and the trade exchanges don't go through the ports. They actually go through the diplomatic relationships between Shogunate Japan and of course, Chosun Korea with Beijing, with China, right? But without this centrality, this imperial centrality of Beijing, you would not have the possibility of the other globalization that is a more mobile globalization, being for people or goods or, again, ideas, capital. So I think that's the reason why the nuance is important, so that we don't expect that it's only formally declared imperial cities that are actually global. But all global cities will be somehow connected to empire. And even if the state does not recognize them as such or does not label them as such.
Can I jump in very quickly to just point out really important, I think, very, very general and perhaps trite parallel to the modern period, to what Catia just said. So I think it's fair to say that also in the modern period, you have different types of imperial cities, right? And also in the modern period, it is correct to say, I think, that different empires interact and interface and use and are used by cities in different ways, right? So I think the point of the conversation today definitely is not to say we come up with a unified grand theory of everything, but rather to talk about certainly general lines, but also to be attentive to real differences between empires and between different cities. Just back to you, Dries.
Well, thank you very much, Cyrus, for intervening here already. Looking backwards or looking forwards from your own perspective to and from the early modern period. In that respect, we'll come back later to the supposed discrepancies between the early modern and the modern era. But I'd like to ask Anne-Isabelle in this respect, because Catia already hinted at the very end of her answer on whether or not we should differentiate between formal and informal empires or cities as part of formal or informal empires. And I was wondering if you, from your background, would be willing to reflect on that.
Thank you, Dries, and also thank you to Cyrus for setting this up. Well, I'm almost hesitating because my answer feels like it's going to be really short. And I think, well, obviously there are differences, but I think informal empire, the literature is by now so large that I think on the whole concept of informal empire, that I wouldn't see a good reason why cities in informal empires wouldn't, like whether you would have to say that only cities that are part of formal empires could count as global cities. So I do see the connection to empire as being probably being constitutive of being a global city, but I don't think you need to focus exclusively on formal empire.
Before you referred to Geneva with the question, is Geneva, should we consider Geneva in the 18th century, in 19th century, as part of the, is it a global city, yes or no?
Yeah, this was sort of me going out of my knowledge base, really. But just thinking about Geneva as a city where the city facilitates a certain freedom of thought and creates this center for Calvinism, whether you have different types of global cities and you have, well, last time we also discussed, and I guess we'll get to that, like this sort of hyper globalized cities, but in an earlier period whether it might also make sense to think of a city like Geneva, from which Calvinism sort of spreads over the world, but which also facilitates people who think differently to come together, whether that would also constitute a global city, even if it might not in other terms. So again, I guess we come back to the question of how do you define a global city? Does it need to match all the criteria of circulation of goods, ideas, capital, people, or can it also be primarily in one or two respects and less so in others?
You know, we're talking about some sort of bandwidth that we can establish in which cities can be placed on a varying degree from very, you know, in which globalization only had a minor effect on the city's evolution compared to then, for example, Canton or Amsterdam or Lisbon or Rio de Janeiro, if you will, in which these cities, which we really define, I think we can all agree that we would define most of these cities as being global cities. Good. Cyrus, yes?
Just sort of on the top of it, let me sort of, you know, add one element here. So I think the question is not only how do we, let's say, very broadly speaking, spatially define what starts to count as global, right? Or define certain themes as having to be necessarily present for something to be called global, but also to talk about, you know, the difference between, let's say, objective structures versus subjective perception, right? So I think it's probably fair to say just because a bunch of people in a city claim that their city is a global city, whatever this may mean, right, doesn't mean that it is that. But perhaps at some point, the sheer number of people who start to say this in a city, and perhaps the sort of way in which they say it and the echo this produces also may be taken into account. So we're talking partly about, let's say, we can partly use a structuralist sort of analysis to talk about what is not, is somehow in some ways global. But at the same point in time, I think we can also talk about subjective perceptions. And I think Geneva may be a really good example in the early modern period, right? Because Calvinists very definitely did believe that in the broader realm of theology, right, Geneva plays a really, really central place. It's a new city to create a new sort of religious world. So what do we do with this? I don't know. It's just, I think we need to sort of pay attention to this subjective perceptual sort of element as well, in addition to everything else.
Okay, you really got me thinking there. I have to admit that I was also going down the structuralist road and thinking about hubs, networks, flows of people, flows of goods. But maybe a distinction between sort of direct and indirect influence could be helpful there. I sometimes use it in class to reflect on the impact of globalization on, you know, the Dutch hinterland with the small villages that hardly ever get in touch with the flows of people and the flows of, well, the flows of good they do, but not the flows of people or the big flows of ideas. But some of the products from the colonies wound up, of course, in that hinterland. And how global is then a small village in the hinterland that drinks coffee and that has some cotton clothing? Is that, I think we can all agree that's not a global city, but what's the bandwidth there? Anne-Isabelle, I see you unmute yourself.
Yeah, I think this we discussed before as well, that you can write a global history of, you know, whatever random village, because either they produce something or it's, you know, the industrious revolution type thing, and therefore they contribute to something global, but they wouldn't be global cities. And you can also write a very parochial history of a global city. So I guess that could be one way of seeing it. I think Geneva is a slightly different category than this type of hinterland type thing. It's more like, which categories do you need to constitute a global city? And is this, because as Cyrus points out, in the religious realm, they claim to be indeed global. And you could also talk about Rome. To which extent is that a global city throughout history just because the Vatican is there? And you could argue that there are ups and downs, and I mean, Rome becomes tiny relatively tiny at a certain point, and it's clearly not the center of the world, except if you think about the church. So I guess that's a different, sort of perhaps a less obvious way of seeing it. And I'm sure I have these two European examples. I'm sure there are similar examples from elsewhere that we could think of. But again, this is probably, I'm more comfortable with the modern period than
I think you're giving us a nice bridge there, Anne-Isabelle, to gradually move into the 19th century. I'd like to also give the word back to Catia, who's been awfully quiet, and I'm really wondering what she's thinking right now, because yeah, in a previous talk, you referred to the fact that according to you, in the 19th century, indeed, we see a growth in urbanization, more cities than before, but according to what you put forward as the variables that we should use to detect global cities, that although there were more cities, they were less global and more specialized than before. Would you care to elaborate on that thought?
Yes, I will, but if I just may return to the last point Anne-Isabelle made, I think it might be useful also to make a distinction, or at least reflect upon a slight distinction between what it is that cities generate that are global, and whether generating global things, movements, ideas actually means that the city as an urban environment is global. And in that sense, I'm going back to my argument on our previous conversation. I cannot put my head around the idea that Geneva or Rome, for that matter, around 1750 are global places. They produce a specific environment that enables a specific global development that is not a global urban development, is a global religious, ideological, cultural phenomena. Then we may ask the question, I think it's pertinent to ask the question, are these global ideological, cultural, religious trends always coming from cities? Not necessarily. In Islam, we know that that is not the case. In some parts of Buddhism, and if we only look at religion, we know that that is not the case. So I'm not sure whether cultural movements, if you look more towards the 19th and 20th century, right? I think these are permanent, are interesting questions to ask, whether a non-global city can produce global change in global movement. I think they can. The largest mobility globalization that we have in the 19th century is not even produced by cities. Cities are turning points to ship people off. The Italians, the Irish, the Middle Easterns, the Eastern Europeans. So I think we may want to reflect collectively about these issues. Now, going back to your point about the 19th century. So what my argument was in our pre-conversation is that once, and this is from a very economic and social history point of view, so I'm very bound to so I'm biased, if you want, by my perspective, is that of course when industrial revolution hits Western Europe, you know, from the English case, obviously, and you get to the point where you get to the globalizing century, that is the 19th century, the liberal century. What I notice is that, of course, you have a whole transition from pre-modern growth into modern growth or industrial capitalism, so from merchant to industrial capitalism. And what you see is the development of the speed up of urbanization throughout, mostly, it starts in the Western world, it spreads elsewhere afterwards, and accelerates with industrialization, right? The problem here is that the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century does two things, and that's why it's called the global century, right? It's gonna develop very strong economies of scale, which means that you have quick urbanization, industrial urbanization. So you have a lot of industry and industrial development in cities that are not that large. I mean, Lancashire is not known by its large cities in the UK. The industrial tissue in Belgium and in Germany, so the first and the second industrial revolution, are not in large cities. These are small little cities. What is very interesting is that these places of modern economic growth are not going to be global leaders in terms of capital transactions, export, import, export, so trade, if you want to, or even redistribution centers. What they are is that they're huge globalizers of labor. They attract labor. So when you look at real global cities, they become so you have hyper specialization in small cities for production usually, but then you have 2 or 3 real global cities where production, financial services, so the tertiary sector and everything that comes with it, plus allocation and redistribution of consumption markets and etc. You know, that this all takes place in a very few handful of cities. And you see this going from, obviously, from Lancashire into London to the city and then to New York. And obviously London and New York do not produce anything for the Industrial Revolution. These are not the cities doing that, but these are the global cities. So, and I think this is very particular. And in this sense, I think this 19th century is the exception rather than the rule, although we always look at the 19th century as somehow the start of the modern world. And then we need to talk about the 19th century, but I think the 19th century is very atypical. And it is very atypical because of this industrial revolution that makes economies of scale specialized. And once you specialize, you lose the ability to be global because you're not serving the principles of the central place as a city, right? Of the central place, of the network. So you are a cog in a machine, but you're not the machine is elsewhere, right? So that is where my argumentation arose from. Yes, there's an explosion in urbanization. Yes, there is hyper globalization in the 19th century. It's the liberal century, but the amount of real global cities that you have by, say, 1900 or 1850 have decreased in number, but I also believe in diversity of regional impact than in, say, 1750. Because what you also see in the 19th century is, of course, what we know in the theories of the rise of the West, obviously, is that the urban balance falls into the West, right? These global cities are all in the West, and they're all in the centers of the industrial modern growth, economic growth, I mean. This again does not mean that there are not important cities that are contributing to the global development of specific trends, of migration, of ideas, of cultural movements, of environmental change, if you want to, right? But those are not, so again, we get to the Geneva-Rome discussion. You can have global things happening in places that are not global, but you can have global cities that are not actually doing much to modern growth, except, for instance, the tertiary sector. So these were my reflections. And it's counterintuitive to a certain extent, and it's also, I think we need more reflection, and we might want to start counting, for instance, very simply, how many people live, work in these global areas in the 19th and until the First World War, let's put it like that, and see whether that makes a real large difference for the early modern period, say 1750. And it's not because quantity matters, but I think that you would be shocked with regional diversity. So you have very global cities in Asia, in South Atlantic already by 1700, but those are not global cities anymore. Most of them are not by 1900 or for 1850, because they're cut off from a lot of the global decision making, if you want to.
Thank you very much, Catia. I assume that Cyrus is triggered by this. I don't know why, but I have this feeling.
You are right. Now, I think this was, Catia, thank you so much. I mean, our first conversation, which was not taped, which was just, us, chatting for 2 hours. I think for me, at the very least, I think sort of this issue was really the most interesting one. And I partly agree, but mainly disagree. And I think that was, the great thing about, having this conversation also, with Catia is that, this works so well, having this disagreement. So let me just say in a couple of points why. Okay, so first thing, I'd say there is one thing that underlies industrialization, which is sort of the key trigger that the Catia identified, right? And that is, very broadly speaking, technological change, right? And not simply change, but the advent of mechanized, basically of mechanized production, which has an effect not only on production itself, but also on transport, as we all know. Now, it's of course true that not everything becomes a steamship immediately. There are lots of other things that continue to happen as well, horses and normal boats, etc. But communication starts to really change, and that in turn means, right, that a good number of basically that the world becomes connected in a much faster way than it used to be before in the 19th century. Now, I entirely agree with Catia that one effect this does have, I would say, is that this partly leads, or one thing that this leads to is a concentration of certain functions, because this is now possible in some cities, in fewer cities, right? And by the way, this is, for instance, something that Saskia, what's her name? Saskia Sassen, I think, talked about when she talks in the late 1980s, early 1990s about the global cities, Tokyo, New York, London. It's a similar story, right? This, greater networking leads to the possibility of greater concentration. However, firstly, I would say that cities like Singapore, for instance, by the late 19th century, are, I mean, other than production of mechanized goods, of basically, products, Other than that, a city like Singapore is just as global as a city like, let's say, London. There is secondary sector, there is a tertiary sector. If we just go for the economy, because we could go for all sorts of different themes of globalization as well. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say, and I would call these cities not global cities, but more specifically global gateways, a word that Catia used before, and I think that makes a lot of sense. The second point I'd like to point out is that at the same point in time that there is hyper concentration, there is also something else, which is a greater integration of more population centers than ever before into a world system, not simply of goods, but also of ideas, of movements. I think we can call these population centers global cities. They're not global hubs. I agree with Catia, but we can call them global cities. There are people now, there are more people whom we know who are somewhere else. There are more goods that we produce and send away and get than we did before. There are more ideas that are circulating in all sorts of different structured ways than before. So I think we can talk about more global cities, perhaps even globalized villages or global villages. So there are these two things that happen at the same point in time: a stretching and a multiplication of the global in more population centers than ever before, and a sort of a hyper concentration, which, however, I really think cannot be simply basically located in, let's say, the Atlantic world, but goes far beyond, right? There are a few other sort of cities that I really do think can be called global hubs, global gateway cities. I want to add the empire issue to this, but maybe we can do this later, because that sort of, opens an entirely, separate sort of can of worms, and I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you very much, Cyrus, for popping in there. Okay, just looking around the room here, Anne-Isabelle, do you want to reflect on what Cyrus and what Catia said from a more modern era perspective?
Yeah, just to ask Cyrus, because you at the end you also mentioned global villages, and I was just curious how you would then see that relate to global cities. I mean, is this what do you mean exactly by global villages? Is this the hinterland that we discussed before, or what is it?
Let me give you an example. Okay, one basically I know a bit better because this is sort of my geographical areas of expertise, which is, the Middle East, generally speaking, and a little bit more specifically, Greater Syria, which is Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Israel, and Jordan. So in the later 19th century, when you have a very fast uptick, a surge really of emigration out of these areas into Africa, Europe, and specifically into the Americas. And then you have a greater integration into the world economy of these places. A good number of things happen in villages like, for instance, Binj Bail, Marjayoun, all sorts of different villages that are really, small, right? You have many more people who now are in contact with others in America. You have remittances that are being sent back. You have basically new social ties. You have new goods that are being consumed, and you have new ideas. Now, all of these changes, in one way or another, I think, need to be reflected in how we think about these villages. I don't call a village a global village because it plays a huge role in the global economy. That would be, of course, totally wrong to say. But I think we can think about it as a global place, or as a place that is networked into the world because of all the things I just said before, in that sense, not in the other sense, of course.
Oh, okay, yeah, then I understand, but that's more like writing the global history of village X.
Yes, I think mainly, but not only, right? Because, for instance, marriage ties also affect the people who are now coming from Marjayoun and live in New York. Very often Marjayoun is in New York, will want to live together. So it's not just, it doesn't just that's a big part of what's.
So technology is failing Cyrus in making his argument. Cyrus,
I'm sorry.
no, you can't help technology. That's global. But would you care to repeat the last sentence you said there?
I think, yes, principally it is about what's going on in these villages, but social ties between Marja Yunis in, for instance, a city like New York, a city like Sao Paulo, continue to matter, right? So it's also something that is happening elsewhere, right? So in a certain sense, this village now, which before was a local thing, perhaps a regional thing, if you know, if we push it, all of a sudden has a presence in social ways, sometimes in literary ways, because there are new journals that are being founded, sometimes by people from around the same sort of background, has a presence elsewhere as well. So it's not just the village, though I would agree it is perhaps primarily that.
Yeah, I have to say that as an early modernist, what you were saying all there, I fail to see differences between, well, I do see a lot of similarities between what you are saying and examples we know from the early modern period, where indeed networks that were very much present in, for example, the Dutch Republic or the Low Countries in general, or Spain or Lisbon, they influenced, of course, social ties and social networks and business networks as well across the Atlantic or in Asia. But does that make them more global? That's a question I'm still stuck with to some extent. But thank you for reflecting on that. Anne-Isabelle, did you unmute yourself because you want to react? Or?
Oh, no. I was still unmuted from when I was talking to Cyrus. But the only thing, I mean, it's a question of how much you want to focus on global cities, and whether you then want to also show the connections and what the repercussions of that are for other localities. Because if your argument is at a certain point in the early 20th century, then a lot of this comes into this. And I wonder, yeah, where do you want to draw the line? I mean, I can totally understand what you're saying about these ties and these literati who went everywhere. And I think for Southeast Asia, there's also lots of work on the early 20th century that shows this, and Rachel Liao's work on the South China Sea, etc. I mean, that's wonderful and really shows the circulation, and we know about the Indian Ocean space and the Hadrami networks and God knows what. But what does that do for the concept of global city, though?
Well, I don't think, just to piggyback on one of the terms you use, like where you draw the line, right? I don't think there is a line to be drawn, like, and beyond that line you are global and before you're not. I know you didn't mean that, but let me just sort of use it. I rather think that we can think, you know, with what Dries, I think, earlier said, there is like a continuum, right? And some villages are really absolutely still cut off from whatever we would call a global, you know, sort of network, and other cities are totally tied into it. And then there are cities that are sort of, you know, located in different bits of this continuum. I think that's sort of how we need to think about it. And this is, I think, doubly interesting because this also interfaces with changing regional patterns of interaction, not simply inter, but intra-regional sort of interactions, right? So, you know, where you are on this continuum has an effect on how you function within your own, let's say, smaller and broader sort of region, right? Which is a separate issue. You didn't talk about this, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but I think it's another really, really interesting thing to sort of behold.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm looking back at our main question, and we've sort of drifted off, but that's fine. We haven't really talked about empires. We have talked more about globalization in the long stretch and how that influences urban development to some extent, and how we have to place urban localities of different sizes, perhaps on some sort of bandwidth between, you know, not at all globalized and very much globalized. And then Catia's remark, I think, was very valuable there to question, well, does do global cities, if however we define them, have to replace on the bandwidth, or are they a separate category that are part of the network but not part of the bandwidth? Well, we're nearing the end of our conversation, and I just wanted to ask you, some of you members here, if you still have a final remark to make, feel free to do so. If you feel like you've said everything, that's fine as well. Cyrus?
Yeah, thank you so much. Let me sort of, pivot exactly to this issue of empires and sort of make a very, very generic argument, okay? It seems to me that we perhaps in the 19th century and into the early 20th century can make a rough and ready distinction between two different types of empires, right? One type are what we used to call, maybe with a good reason, land empires, and the other, which are mainly basically Eurasian empires, right? So going from, Qing China to, Qajar Iran, to the Ottoman Empire, to the Habsburg Empire. Perhaps we could include the Russian Empire in there too, on the one side. And then on the other side, we have, let's call them maritime empires, which are principally the European ones that basically expand. It appears to me that the latter, the European Maritime Empire, to use that name, although it's a bit outdated and a bit complicated, had an interest of both a political and a commercial nature to concentrate more functions in what I think Frederick Cooper once called a capillary way within a smaller amount of places. That is, or to speak in proper English here, okay? That is, I think it was Cooper who said that colonial power of those empires functions in a capillary way. It's all thumbs. There are not lots of digits and certainly not pinkies, right? Which also means that for different reasons, mainly political and commercial, very often a lot of functions get concentrated in a particular city. I think, and I would love to hear more from Anne-Isabelle what she thinks about this. I think, for instance, in West Africa, this would be Dakar, right? To take one example, a lot of things happen there. Now, on the other side, which means also that cities and empires, also global cities, I wouldn't call Dakar, I don't know whether we can call it a global hub. Certainly it's a global city by the later 19th century, right? Now, in Eurasian land empires, and certainly the Ottoman Empire, right? Again, for partly political and commercial reasons, the empire, the imperial government, very often I think has an interest in diversifying. So in the Ottoman Empire in the later 19th century, for instance, the Ottoman Empire had to, Istanbul, the government, had to go and had to accept, and actually to a degree even nurtured, the explosive growth of Beirut on the coastline, right? Beirut becomes basically the biggest city, not the biggest in population, but in terms of its commercial and cultural influence in Greater Syria in the second part of the 19th century. However, at the same point in time, partly in order to balance out the power of Beirut, which helped a lot of Western actors as well, which was something that frightened the Ottoman elite also very much politically, commercially backed the big cities in the hinterland, Damascus and Aleppo, right? And particularly in the case of Aleppo, that meant that although older, thicker commercial ties all the way to East Asia became much less important than they used to be, Aleppo didn't just fall off the map. It continued to be an important commercial and cultural and also administrative center in the Ottoman Empire. So I don't know, I can't say too much about sort of other Eurasian land empires, but it appears to me that for different reasons, perhaps the latter empires, those Eurasian ones, have their elites, their political elites, have a stake in trying to keep more than simply one city sort of around. While in the maritime empires, in particular multi-colonial regions such as West Africa, which is ultimately multiple areas within French West Africa, this is perhaps less the case. I don't know, an argument to be made.
I wonder whether I do think there is a distinction between land empires and sort of maritime empires, for want of a better term. But I wonder if that's the only one, whether it's, I think, well, French West Africa was, I guess, also a sort of specific case. And whether it doesn't also have something to do with the way these empires operated, in the sense, the way that the French came and progressively conquered bits of the sort of hinterland, or conquered, or whatever you want to call it, and the way that worked for the Ottomans. And I was also thinking whether this had something to do with sort of empires after the scramble for Africa and those that were there before. But then if I think about the Dutch East Indies, I mean, Batavia, well, as Jakarta was called, was clearly the biggest, was very much the center. Although there are obviously also other important cities, Semarang or Medan or whatever, but yeah, I'm not sure that it's just about maritime versus land empires, or whether it has to do something with sort of, which is sort of similar, but perhaps conceptually slightly different, sort of when you conquer your neighbors, or whether it has something to do, I mean, thinking about all the whole trope about the Ottomans as the sick man of Europe, sort of like managing, well, obviously Cooper and Burbank's term, empire is managing different people differently, but whether if you are sort of experiencing some sort of imperial overstretch, you have to do this type of thing that you describe. I don't have an answer here, but I'm just trying to think through other ways that might influence what you describe, because I do agree that Dakar was, in French West Africa, was clearly the biggest hub. Now, if you think about the whole of West Africa, so also including what becomes part of the British Empire, then, I mean, there are other cases to think about. And I think in the British case, it's probably less obvious what would be the center. But even not that long ago, in terms of higher education, in the whole of Francophone Africa, Dakar was a center, reaching as far as Madagascar. So, I mean, I think that's also slightly different, perhaps. And Mitch may say something about, if you think about France and the role of Paris. But that's perhaps a different discussion.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I'm being drawn into the discussion. I'm looking at the time. I'm going to round off, well, start to round off, but I'd like to throw the ball one last time to Catia, who I see sometimes frown, sometimes smile. So I'm wondering what she's happy with, what she's not so happy with, in an effort to try to close off the discussion, or at least open-ended discussion, but at least give it a final word. Catia.
Well, I'm not going to open the conversation again. I think we can keep conversing for the coming years, and it's very exciting actually that we don't agree. So that's actually what makes us interesting as historians, I think. And I think also source material matters, and also queries. How do you come up with your queries? So are you thinking from the point of view of the city, or are you thinking about the impact of something that happens in the specific locality has in the world? I think this matters to actually talk about global cities or global things that happen, and they tend to be connected through, at times, urban spaces, which are two different things in my view. But I don't want to open the discussion again. I would just let perhaps one point that we did not talk about, that I think it's particularly important when you think of empires in whatever context related to urbanity or to any other discussion. And I think we didn't touch upon that at all. And that's power. Power differentials matter. And in that sense, going back very shortly to Singapore, no, I do not think that Singapore is a global city, because Singapore has in fact no power, and it has no power at the moment that you're putting forward your argument. Neither does Burma, neither does Indonesia, Dutch East Indies. So Batavia has no power or very little power. And that's the whole point of imperialism, actually of colonialism, is that, and perhaps I would finish there. I think perhaps that one of the most pernicious changes that we see in world history from colonialism into imperialism is that that share of power that was still yet not controlled by the heads of the empires and allowed to a certain extent these global cities connected to empires to proliferate until, say, the Age of Revolutions, disappears because the power of the imperial state rises in such a manner that the power differential just curbs Singapore and shuts Singapore down. In fact, Singapore is, in my view, far less global by 1850 than it was perhaps in 1750, because London has taken this power differential in such a way that there's no way that Singapore actually functions without London. And it doesn't function in terms of institutions. Financial institutions are particularly pernicious with these things. And I think that these power differentials actually connected to empire and the transition from colonialism into imperialism actually are going to strangulate the regional diversification and spreading of global cities connected to empire that the early modern period saw, and that the modern period tends to eradicate. London, New York, Lisbon, Paris are not willing to share power differentials anymore. And Dakar may be a fantastic global African city, but Paris still commands what happens in Dakar. And I think, speaking of power, after the Age of Revolutions and the power of the nation state as the red thread that commands empire matters in determining this globality of cities. It doesn't mean, again, that Dakar and Singapore does not contribute to globalization and to the global, and are not influenced by the global, but they do not command the global. So my point would be bringing power, political state power. I mean, be wary of it and not trust everything that has been written about power. Power is also a very abstract thing, but I think power matters after the Age of Revolution. And even China, that is always the place where I like to look at to think of, so are we being too Eurocentric? Even China gets, to a certain extent, to a very large extent, it's connected to the global because of the way imperial powers are dealing with China. And it goes for the Europeans, goes for the Americans in the late 19th and 20th century.
Thank you.
So yes, I would stop there.
Thank you very much, Catia. It's well, at one moment in time in your answer, it looked like you were traveling towards the light, towards the end of the discussion. You were all lightened up, and now you're at the end, and we've reached the end of our conversation too. And I'd like to thank all of you very much, Catia and Anne-Isabelle, for sharing their expertise on this subject, for sharing their thoughts with Cyrus and myself. And of course, for anyone interested in more in-depth analysis, what we've talked about here, more examples, I would gladly refer to the journal Itinerario, which with a lot of case studies touches upon these topics as well, with special issues. The publications of the panel members present here, of course, as well. And on the other hand, to what the Global Urban History Project has been producing. It's still in its infancy, but I'd like to refer to, for example, a special issue on urban history in the special issue in the journal Urban History on early modern global urbanized environments, edited by Mariana Dantas and Emma Hart. And the new series that was published just last year started off, The Cambridge Elements in Global Urban History, edited by Michael Guhp, Tracy Newman, and Joseph Ben Prestel. That touches upon a lot of these topics in a very thematic manner. Okay, then we're at the end of our conversation. Once again, thank you very much, Catia and Anne-Isabelle, for joining us. And I'd like to give the word to Cyrus to close off this meeting. Thank you.
Just to say thank you so much, Dries, for a wonderfully moderated session and really great questions. And thanks, Anne-Isabelle and Catia, for really very thought-provoking discussion. And I hope this will be useful to the listeners. And I think that is it from my side. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm going to close off the recording now. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.